All right, so Stormlight 5 just happened, Wind and Truth. Maybe you are now the reader who's like, okay, should I read this? Is this an ending point? Do I just wait 10 years for book 6 to come out? You probably have these questions if you clicked on this video. You probably also have questions such as Cosmere reading order. Everyone and their mother has a version of this. Even I have a version of this. I will link that down below. Reading Wind and Truth has not changed my opinion on Cosmere reading order. And if you don't want to watch any videos on it and you are someone who's like, I want to experience Easter eggs, like someone consuming this for the first time, go publication order and you will be fine. That said, I know people who read Stormlight in a vacuum and have a good time. There are going to be people on the internet who tell you people cannot read Stormlight in a vacuum and have a good time. Maybe you aren't someone who could read Stormlight in a vacuum and have a good time. We'll talk about it. But at its core, the characters, the plot, the world building you need to know is all contained within the 5 novels and 2 novellas that exist within the Stormlight archive. And it's long. So I make this Should You Read series because series are a time investment, they're a money investment. So maybe getting a sense of what the series has to offer, does it stick the landing, etc., gives you a sense of should you invest that time and money into it. And I think actually back in the day before we had Wind and Truth, my first one might have been for the first 4 books of the Stormlight archive. Especially because this is one of my favorite series of all time. Okay, I started in 2010. I've read Way of Kings, every year a new book's come out. So not as many as some people. I haven't read Way of Kings more than 5 times. Some people have read it way more. But I've been reading Stormlight. I am the audience for Stormlight Archive. But I'm going to give this review knowing that not everyone is the audience. And honestly, I hate when people consume things I like and don't have a good time. Go consume other art that'll be fun for you. You don't need to consume my favorite thing if you're going to hate it, And I am someone who forced myself to read a long-running epic fantasy series that I shouldn't have. That's me and Wheel of Time. I was not the audience for Wheel of Time, but I still read all 15 books. I do have a video for that if you want to know my opinions. But I recognize I just wasn't the audience, I wanted to be, but I wasn't. And maybe that's the case with Stormlight for you. Let's just get into it a little bit. So what is the Stormlight Archives? It's an indulgently long fantasy series. It's an epic fantasy. And when you start off primarily with this warlike kingdom that's fighting for revenge on what is called the Shattered Plains. And at its core, this is about a turning point in history for this world. The world has been functioning at its current status quo relatively well for thousands of years. But within the last 20 or so years, things have been set in motion to basically restart what is called a desolation, which has happened. The first prologue of this book is about the end of a desolation. And so magic is coming back. Preparation for this desolation has to happen. What is a desolation? Who is involved? These are the questions you're going to have globally throughout the whole series. And then at its core, you're following characters who are really messed up and they really need to deal with their, local situations and also their mental baggage. And that's kind of what people love the most. The magic and following our core group of characters, adding on more characters. Each book is relatively contained, which is really nice. I have never finished a Stormlight book not wanting the next Stormlight book. That has always been the case. But I've never left it with those huge cliffhangers that make me go, oh my god, what am I going to do? Except for once. And that's because I read Way of Kings before Wheel of Time was finished, and then I was distraught. That was the only time. So that's basically what it is. Now, again, I say it's indulgently long. If you do not like long books, you will have a hard time enjoying Stormlight Archive for what it is. It's meant to be epic fantasy that is long, which means at times it's going to be boring. It is inconsistently paced. Some books have better pacing than others. I would say books 2, 4, and 5 probably have the best pacing, and books 1 and 2 probably have the weirdest, wonkiest pacing, but books 1 and 3, and I meant books 1 and 3 have wonky pacing, not 1 and 2. Books 1 and 3 are my favorite because you really get these slow, meandering moments with the characters and just wandering this lush landscape that's been created. So the pacing's inconsistent. It's really long. There are amazing interludes. I will not... People don't like the interludes. The interludes are great. It's what makes the world so vast and it's so fun. But again, it's on the tin, okay? The first book was 1,001 pages. It's not like we started off with Realm of the Elderlings where Assassin's Apprentice is 400 pages and then everything's been 600 plus since. This is meant to be stupid long. And for me, that's worked with mixed success. Like Oathbringer, my first read, I was exhausted. I was like, what is this? But Oathbringer is now my favorite book after 3 rereads. And the last 2 releases, like Wind and Truth, was impeccably paced for me. Like, I didn't feel exhausted at all. I just read it over the course of a couple weeks, and I just had a really fun time. So just know that. It's long. Maybe, if you've not read Sanderson before and you want to get a sense of if his style of crafting a story is worth it for you without, reading a 1,000-page book, it might be worth it to try Mistborn, which is only a 600-page book, and a lot of people would agree can work even as a standalone book. So, it has like an ending to it. So you could try that. I do think in some ways Mistborn is a more fun series because it's tighter. But that's its nature. Like, they aren't the same project. They just have similar writing styles. So if you want to see if the writing style works, maybe that's what you should do. Now, I already talked about it like the top of this video. Can you read just Stormlight? I already just mentioned maybe try Mistborn to try out his writing style. Or he has some standalones you could try. I will say, and in terms of one of the standalones, Warbreaker, that's probably the only one where I'm like, if I could tell people to read like one Cosmere book in addition to Stormlight that would be like required reading, and if you're not watching, I put quotes there, it would be Warbreaker. Because there are Easter eggs, there's crossovers, there are characters from books that show up here. The most obvious ones of those are from Warbreaker. Okay? Now, is it essential? No, because I didn't even know one of the character crossovers until like 4 years ago, and again, I've been reading this series since like 2010. My mom knows nothing about these crossovers and is having a fantastic time. They are just fun Easter eggs. Now, if you're the type of person where the whole point of reading the Cosmere is seeing the Easter eggs and making the connections and learning how all the magic systems interconnect, then yes, read more of the Cosmere first. Like I said, usually publication order is a pretty safe bet, or bare minimum, read Warbreaker. That's how I would maybe recommend it. But it's not essential. It's truly not. What happens to Kaladin is not dependent on if you've read Mistborn, Elantris, and Warbreaker and everything like that. That's just like not the case. Some things might be confusing to you, but they're not essential things, and you won't know what you're missing. You can always reread this series later within the context of the Cosmere if suddenly you're like, I want to be a Cosmere leader. Now, what I typically have done with people in my life, so I have people in my real life who have been reading Stormlight, and I'm like, when you finish Oathbringer, and maybe even before you finish Oathbringer, you get to decide how much of the Cosmere you want to understand before you get into Rhythm of War. Because that's when it starts to get a little like, woo, a lot's going on here. How much of this am I supposed to understand? And some of them are just going to finish Stormlight. They don't want the complexity. And I'm like, that's okay. And some of them might go back and read Mistborn Era 2 and read Warbreaker. It depends on who you are and what you want from the experience. But don't let the internet bully you, because it's supposed to be fun, which I think a lot of people forget sometimes. So let's talk about the meat of this series, though. Characters. I really love the characters, but I also think this can be sometimes where some of my flaws exist. So, for example, our characters all have struggles. Some are more like classic, this is chronic depression, this is anxiety, etc., like some like actual mental health situations. Some of them are just, going through change, trying to, reconcile with things you've done in your past. What can happen, in particular with Kaladin and Shallan, who are 2 of our like main characters, is that because these series are so long, and because of where Sanderson wants them to come to their revelations when in the series, things can feel repetitive, or feel like, I thought we accomplished something, and now we've taken 2 steps back. And part of that is, mental health is a cycle. It is not linear. If you struggle with mental health, you can have a breakthrough 1 month and regress the next. And that's normal. You are not a failure. And that's the same for these characters. But in terms of a reading experience, it can be exhausting. There is no character who exhausts me more than Kaladin. He is a favorite character for many. I like him. I think I might like him a tad bit more after Wind and Truth. But at the end of the day, a lot of my frustration and boredom is in his arc, and not because it's not portrayed accurately. Okay? Similarly with Shallan. No one stresses me out more than Shallan. Oh boy. Oh boy. Similarly with a lot of other characters in Dalinar, but what's fun also is, and this happens to a lot of people at different points, which is really funny to me. There are characters you might start hating, and then suddenly you're like, wait, I love them now? This happens to a lot of people for one particular character that I won't mention to like sway you. Then there are other characters who you like, and then you're like, oh, no, don't like you. And I think the supporting cast is fairly strong. I really love a lot of the supporting cast, especially the ones that are teased to become like more like main characters later on. I think that's wonderful. Yeah, I think in general, the characters are unique. They're distinct, and if you do not like Sanderson's dad humor, you might have struggles with some characters. In particular, we have a young character named Lift that people never like her jokes because, God forbid, a 10-year-old have 10-year-old humor. I don't know. The internet can get weird. But I mean, it's fair. Like, I don't really like those types of jokes either. It just doesn't take away from the experience to me. I just, like, read the line and I move on. But that's probably because I don't find a lot of things funny. And so I have to spend a lot of my life in the real world just, like, hearing people say jokes at me and either not getting it or not thinking it's funny. Or both. And just going, okay, well, I'm just going to move on with my day because I don't know what just happened. And that's just my brain not always connecting. So yeah, those are the things about the characters, and that's probably what people love the most. And I'm gonna be real, having read Wind and Truth, the payoff of these character arcs, and I spent all of last year rereading the series, so like, I remember Baby Shallan, I remember Baby Kaladin, and like, to see what they have done come Wind and Truth, I'm just like, oh, you guys, the growth. And it's just, that's exciting to see. You want there to be growth, you want there to be payoff. One of my complaints about Wheel of Time, which is one of the only series I can really compare this to, is I didn't feel that same way about those characters. Some people do. That's just my own personal experience in Wheel of Time, is I didn't feel that Matt or Egwene or Rand had these like arcs that I felt buy into. And I feel that here with these characters. Now, the world building. This is something where like I didn't realize his style of world building was so niche, at least to me, until I started reading other books with different ways of world building. So, I mean, me in like 2012, I was all in on this type of hard magic system, this type of rigorous world building, and it's still probably my comfort zone, but it's not my favorite anymore. So what I mean by hard magic, if you've never heard that term before, is that the magic of this world could be modeled like we model things in science. It's very physics-based, it's very derived on hard rule sets. If there's something we don't know it can do, it's just because we don't know the rules. But there are rules, there are limits, there are boundaries, and they are well known by Brandon Sanderson as he crafts things. And that's for all of his books, not just Stormlight. Another thing that I love about this is that it's a very science-first portrayal. I know so much about the flora and fauna of Roshar. Roshar is such a cool planet. It has these storms that come through, and they are just like hurricane-level winds. So how all the architecture has to be built, how all the plants have to evolve and adapt to survive these storms that happen every month is really cool. Also, the science of how they take the magic and make it so it like does, it's like kind of almost steampunky at times. It's very cool. It's like future fantasy is not really a subgenre, but that's what it feels like to me. Where the world building is lacking is in the cultural world building. And it's not lacking in terms of, outfits. If you want aesthetic differences between your cultures, those exist in spades. If you want reasons for why cultures do what they do, we don't know why people aren't allowed to show a hand in Roshar. We don't know why there's a safe hand for the Alethi. We know that there is. And we don't know why men and women eat different food. We know that they do. It's very much that. We know what the cultures have. We don't know why. And sometimes if you poke at the why, it might crumble a little bit. It's like, this doesn't really make sense. But you can also argue a lot of cultural norms might not make sense hundreds of years after they've been established. One thing, though, I also wish is we spend a lot of time with the Alethi. That's a name I have said. They are a more warlike kingdom. That's who we start with. That's where all our characters are. You're going to spend a lot of time with this culture. Hypothetically, there are a lot of cultures, and you get to start to know more about them as the series goes on, but never to the same level or complexity, and I think that's a missed opportunity. So I say that only so that if you are someone who's like government systems, cultural differences, world building, that's your candy, that's what you love, this is probably not that series for you. I mean, you'll get a little bit, but probably just enough to annoy you. Like, it's not bad. It's just not great. I would say it's average to slightly above average cultural world building. All right, so the last question that I have posited for myself to answer is book 5 an ending? Is this a resting point that will sustain you for the next 10 years? Because that's where we're at. 8 to 10 years. Oh boy, what a time. Sort of. I don't think it feels that different than the ending of a lot of other Stormlight books to me. I feel like every Stormlight book I've ever finished has caused a paradigm shift. And then I'm always excited to see how rereading with that paradigm shift in mind goes, and also how we're going to continue based off the new shift. And I think maybe this is a bigger paradigm shift. And also our characters have definitely gotten to really go through huge arcs that have started since the first book. But otherwise, I just stared at a wall making sounds when I finished this book because I don't know if I feel like my characters are necessarily in good positions. Like, it doesn't feel like a finale. It just feels like, okay, that was another Stormlight book. Let's keep going. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't pick it up. Like, I don't think this is a series that is beneficial on just reading it one time through, all the way through. And I would say that about a lot of long epic fantasy series. I think one of the things that is a disservice to me, and again, all I can really compare this to is Wheel of Time, because that's like the same kind of density of epic fantasy. Like, I don't think Malazan or Realm of the Elderlings are good comparison points. But with Wheel of Time, I think a lot of the love in the fandom is people kept getting to reread the books before the next book came out, like what I'm doing with Stormlight. I think that's where a lot of the joy comes in. Not because you miss things on your first read, but because you get to re-experience them and get something new. I think that's where the joy comes from. I really, like I said, it's not that you miss something. It's not like there are these small things that you missed and then you get to connect the dots together on a reread. No, if you read it, book 1 through 5, right now, you would get everything. You wouldn't have to reread one because it's so dense or complicated or anything like that. But, you know, you wouldn't have, I don't know, the same knowledge of the paradigm shift and then the reread. And that's, I think, what I like. It's like, okay, I read Way of Kings. Oh my goodness, that's a huge reveal. So rereading Way of Kings, knowing that, ooh. And then 2, ooh, bigger reveal. And then 3, it's like, what? This shifts the whole thing. You know, and like, I think rereading with that is really fun. And then also just the community aspect. So I would say waiting till book 10 is out. I mean, you're going to be waiting like 5 million years. Like, it's just not happening. And also, I think it truly is, like, if you want a long, indulgent fantasy series experience, this is the one to jump in on. This is the one to join with the community. You got plenty of time to catch up. So much time, even. I'm so excited to reread this in 8 years. Maybe with a bunch of the other Cosmere books, because, like, it's still just a really well-written story, even without its larger multiverse implications a la MCU, you know? But let me know in the comments down below if you have any questions. Per usual with my Should You Reads, these comments need to be spoiler-free. I will delete any comments I consider a spoiler, and I get to decide that. Let me know in the comments if there's anything you would add on to someone who's thinking about reading Stormlight. Good or bad, but always respectful. It's a big time sink. And I would also say that just as a general rule, if you've read Way of Kings and Words of Radiance, and you're really like, I don't think I like this series, I don't know if you're going to. There are edge cases where people read Oathbringer and, like, that brings them back in. But even then, I would say books 4 and 5 read more like Words of Radiance. So if you don't really like Way of King and Words of Radiance, I don't think the series is going to give you a lot. Now, if you're like, but it gives me enough, that's your call. But I'm just letting you know from, like, a writing style perspective, it's fairly consistent. If anything, the big shift is that it's a more intimate story earlier on because we start with like 3 or 4 characters and in a small part of Roshar with small problems. And then the problems get bigger and we travel to more places and we get more characters. So it just becomes less intimate. And that just comes with its own set of problems and pros and cons. So that's the big difference. But how you get a complete story each book, how the magic is, how the characters are, how it's really long, that's going to feel the same regardless. So yeah, that's this video. If you just want to leave an emoji to let me know you're here, leave a storm cloud. And otherwise, like if you liked it, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye! bye.